All right, what's up, everybody? So, topic for today is progression potential on certain lifts, and this is something that gets talked about quite a bit, especially years back. Like when I first started lifting, people would say the value of a lift is how much you can push progressive overload on it, because that used to be what we all believed. If you can keep adding weight, you'll just keep getting bigger. There's truth to it, but that means with that philosophy and taking that approach, whether progressive overload's the cause of the outcome doesn't actually matter, but it changes your approach, because if you believe progressive overload causes hypertrophy, this causes you to write off things that you can't force progressive overload on as much or as quickly or for as long. So that's something I've talked about a handful of times, but that also ties into today's topic, which is progressive overload potential on lifts and when this does apply and when this does not apply. So the common thing is you want to do lifts that are, say, the big three, where the progressive overload potential is crazy, because not only can you add weight, but you can actually master the skill and get better at the skill. That's not necessarily productive for hypertrophy, so I think that whole thought process and approach got totally overblown. But I think when you look at progressive overload potential, the most overrated part about this is how much weight can you add to the lift. Because there's ways around that. Like people will say, oh, cables you can't really do. You can't really progress on them because eventually you'll be at the whole stack. Or a selectorized machine, same concept. It's a cable machine, basically. And I would agree with that to an extent, I guess, in a practical way, but gym pins also exist. I'm not sponsored by them, it's easy to keep adding weight to things. Same with dumbbells. People say, oh, the dumbbells max out. It's like, if you want to get Olympic dumbbells, you can do that too. They go up to heavier than you'd ever need to, but that's all kind of besides the point. So when it comes to progressive overload potential, or just progression potential in terms of adding weight on a certain lift, the most important, and I would say by far the most underrated factor that nobody talks about, is your technique. So how much weight can you add? Because as you get big, you will end up being strong, and you're just going to have to use more weight, just because, one, you're strong, two, it's just more practical. That's why you see me going heavier on most of my lifts. It's because I got big, so I got strong. It's how much does your technique have to deviate based on the lift that you're doing over time as you add weight. So what I mean by that is something like a standing barbell curl. People say it's a barbell, it's a basic, it's the best lift there is for biceps, because it's a barbell, you can add weight forever. And technically that's true. But if you look at your technique's going to be way different if you're a 150 pound or say 200 pound person, let's say myself. If I'm curling 50 pounds, that's a quarter of my body weight. So at peak resistance, I have 50 pounds offsetting my 200 pound self. I have it a forearm's distance in front of me. That's fine, because it's only 50 pounds. What if I'm curling 130 pounds, or just a plate 135 pounds? That's, what, 65, almost 70, maybe 70% of my body weight at that point? That's much tougher to stabilize. My body's going to have to move in all these little intricate ways to be able to kind of offset that weight that's pulling me forwards, because it's not my entire body weight, but it's not that far off in the big picture. So I will have to either pull my elbows back, I'll have to shoot my hips forwards, or I can just stand still and it will pull me forwards. And these are all ways that your technique has to change, and you have to cheat. And I'm not saying that cheat's always the end of the world, and I'm not saying if you're strong you shouldn't do barbell curls, but it's something that you should take into mind, or take into account, when you're picking a lift that has good progression potential. So if you take that same curl example and say you do something like a preacher curl, where the point of contact is no longer your feet and the floor, it's your upper arm and your elbows on a stable preacher pad that can basically handle, realistically, thousands of pounds without even budgeting. That's something that has good progression potential, even though it's an isolation lift, because my form isn't going to change. It's an isolation, and it's locked in, it's stable because of the preacher pad. So something like that, like a preacher curl, does have good progression potential, and that's something that you can just milk out forever. So if you want to milk out a lift and become what I would say like a master of a certain lift, something like a preacher curl is actually an excellent lift to be using. And this is why so many people ended up with spider mode physiques, because they thought isolation lifts don't have good potential and compound lifts do, so I'm just going to do compounds and compound lifts. depending on the style that you do. If you're just kind of conventional with your thinking, you're just going to look like a power lifter, because the compound lifts, or free weight compound lifts, are the best potential outside of unique hybrids like a JM press or a plat style squat, for example. These lifts are going to bias the bigger muscles around the bigger joints, so things like your traps, your lats, your chest, your glutes, stuff like that. So progressive overload potential, or progression potential on each lift, it is important when you're taking that into account, especially if you want to just truly zone in and lock in and master a lift, and you just like to kind of be like that, which I do. I like to keep doing the same lift as long as I can. It's important to actually look at each lift and how stable it is, rather than just, is it a compound or an isolation, or is it a big three, or is it an accessory lift, or something like that. So it's a little bit more complex, just not even more complex, just more nuanced. And nobody really talks about that. And that's why I can keep doing these isolation lifts that are just very stable, and I keep getting strong and I keep getting big using these lifts. And it tends to get overlooked quite a bit. People will say, oh, this guy does a lot of isolation. He couldn't have gotten so big just doing isolation. It's all from compounds. These are just accessory lifts that you do at the end of the session and do 3x10 and don't really think about it. It doesn't make any sense. So I just wanted to debunk that real quick and hopefully give you a new thought process and just give you a little bit of a look into how I think about my training and everything. So hopefully that makes sense. And I'm about to get on the highway, so I'm gonna save your ears and end the video here.